Welcome to NAIS Member Voices. I'm Scott Donaldson, Member Engagement Director at the National Association of Independent Schools. This month, guest host Link Nicoll speaks with Greg Schneider, head of Belmont Hill School in Belmont, Massachusetts. Greg discusses the unique challenges and opportunities of running a school for boys, including the importance of mentorship, the nuances of masculinity, and insights on approaching character development and mental health. He also highlights the significance of faculty recruitment and the role of governance at his school. Here's Link.
Thanks, Scott. Greg, welcome to Member Voices.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
We'd like to start our conversation with your leadership journey and how you came to be a head of school, not just once, but twice. Was this always your aspiration? Is this something you always wanted to be?
Yeah, it has been a journey. What I would say is I was fortunate enough to have a chance to go to an independent school in seventh grade, and certainly the first in our family, along with my sisters, to have that chance. And I will say it was a transformational experience for me. I'd say almost immediately I connected to teachers and mentors, people that I sort of wanted to be in certain ways. And also it was an experience that really got me to appreciate sort of, I don't know, a Renaissance experience, a well-rounded, education. So leaving high school, it was definitely in my mind that I could see myself in an environment like that. And then in the journey through college, I sort of tried to retain this commitment to crossing a lot of boundaries, intellectual, academic, artistic, athletic. I guess the journey from there, believe it or not, coming out of college, my first teaching job was at a prep school on the big island of Hawaii. That was quite a thing coming right out of school, and had a great experience there teaching English, coaching 3 sports, living in the dorms. And then I had played college football, and I had a chance to explore college coaching, and sort of went back to Amherst College where I went to school and thought for a time I might be a college football coach. And that was its own journey where I learned a lot about details and, outreach and a lot of good management skills, I'd say. But pretty quickly I realized I was missing the well-rounded experience of schools as opposed to doing one thing all the time. So transitioned back to graduate school. During graduate school, I had a chance to do a really wonderful internship up at Phillips Exeter in the world of admissions, and then kind of got on a journey that combined admissions, teaching English, coaching, which I had a chapter down in New York before getting my first headship, which was up in Southern Maine at Berwick Academy, where I was for 11 years. And I was named at a relatively young age. That was exciting. I started the job at 33. I think I was named when I was 32, did 11 years there. And then this is now my 8th year at Belmont Hill. The only other piece I'd say about the journey is that there have been some pretty key mentors along the way for me, within the industry who helped steer me, guide me. And I think for anybody who's aspiring to leadership, within these schools, having those mentors is so critical. So I don't feel like I sort of got here entirely on my own. But in terms of the path, that was the path for me.
Did you go to an academic program as part of that?
Undergrad, I was an English and economics major, and those things have served me well. I was an English teacher, coming out of college. And then when I did the master's program at Harvard, which was kind of a broad, individualized school leadership program, which for me included some pieces of financial management, some more deep work in study of teaching, thinking about equity and access. Took a course at the business school, which I found really interesting. So that was sort of a broad experience. And then the actual field experience out at Phillips Exeter was pretty meaningful for me as well. Beyond that, in terms of education, I would say when I became a head, probably the best thing I did was kind of do a whole bunch of like CFO financial boot camp work. You don't learn all those skills being a teacher and a coach. And that was probably another journey. I was also fortunate. I believe I was in the first cohort of the NIS Ford Aspiring Heads group. And so that was one of the things that launched me to my first headship. And it was a pretty meaningful experience for me. I was a director of admissions at the time. It's fun to think how so many of us have gone on to be heads, in large part thanks to the support of the Ford Foundation and NIS at the time.
Now I'm wondering though, so you were at a co-educational school, Berwick Academy, and then you now find yourself head of a boys' school. One of the questions we always ask heads of school is, how do you define leadership? But I kind of want to switch it around a little bit for you. I'm wondering how you find leadership as applied to a school for boys.
I'll start by saying I feel like I live a double life because I'm the father of three girls. And so every time I cross the street now, I go from the land of being a dad to three amazing women and then come over to 470 boys every day now. So it's quite a change when I go across the street the afternoon. I think what drew me to Belmont Hill first and foremost, more so than being a boys' school, was its unbelievable focus on character. And for me, whatever school I've been in, co-ed or not, that has always been a research passion of mine. I've always believed that character education, while difficult to measure and all of that quantify, is really the most important work we do in terms of creating good people. And so that passion of this school, I think, drew me here. Now that I'm running a boys' school, I have a lot more appreciation for the nuance of that and what it means to kind of run a boys' school. I mean, one thing this role makes you think about a lot is sort of society's definition of masculinity. What does it mean? What does it mean to give these boys a positive vision of maleness in a world where they're getting a lot of negative, both kind of social media messages and other media messages about maleness? I'm a big believer that if we don't give them a positive vision for masculinity, they're going to find a definition of it somewhere else, and we may not like, what they find. And we're certainly big believers in, not using phrases like toxic masculinity and trying to not think boys there's something inherently toxic about being male. But it's also true we're preparing kids here for a coeducational world. So we think hard about shared intellectual partnerships with girls' schools, making sure that we're aware of both the strengths and the liabilities of being a single sex school for our boys. One thing that, I always say at our open houses when people are thinking, often the data would say that most of our families are not choosing Belmont Hill because it's a boys' school, but our graduates, when they leave us, would say it's one of the absolute most important parts of the experience. I suspect there are other reasons driving their decision to come here first about programs and culture and, other things. The one thing I would say is that we're at a point now, and I'll give a nod to Tom Batty, who's the executive director of the International Boys School Coalition, who I think was the first one I heard say something like this. We get asked all the time about what do we do to prepare these boys for a co-ed world? And we should get asked that. And the reality is we have to think about that, think about programs that will prepare our boys well. On the flip side, I always challenge people, if you're going to go look at a coeducational school, I think it's also important to ask, given what we know about the different developmental timelines of boys and girls, that certainly in their adolescence years, the male brain could be as much as, 12 to 18 months behind on a comparative basis. I think the way that boys learn is different in some pretty fundamental ways. Sort of what does the co-ed school do to try to meet the needs of boys specifically within their community? Because we think that's important too. There's plenty of data out there about how boys are actually struggling. And one thing, I know we can talk about this more, it does feel like a strong moment for boys' schools with people like Richard Reeves from, putting out books like of Boys and Men about the data suggesting, where boys are struggling. There are other voices like Scott Galloway talking about masculinity in powerful ways. And I think parents are aware of this. And obviously, many of those differences are more pronounced based on socioeconomic class. So I don't want to suggest it sort of applies equally to everyone. But I do think parents are thinking a lot about boys role modeling who they will become. And I think our message is resonating a little bit more deeply today, maybe than it did 10 or 15 years ago for that reason.
Could you be a little specific about some of the programs that you have that are unique to Belmont Hill and that are particularly designed with boys in mind?
Yeah, I can speak to that to a certain degree. First, there's just, Michael Thompson worked at Belmont Hill for many years. And one of the things he used to do is challenge us as co-ed heads, which he did when I was running a co-ed school, to just simply go back and look at your academic award winners, over the past 10 to 20 years. And at least at my school, it was noticeable to see the gender skew there. And then it forces you to ask questions about, well, why is that the case? What is it, maybe that we're rewarding that is leading to that? When I think about Belmont Hill, I think often people, I think, our boys are in coats and ties. We've got this wonderful Latin program. I think it's easy to look at us and just put the word traditional, on what we do. The reality is, I think a lot of the teaching we do is quite progressive. It's just more framed in this idea of like what works best for boys to learn, and really doesn't matter whether it's traditional or progressive. So some examples of that in our, physics classes, when we're talking about things like friction and what have you, we're having boys build toboggans. We're sending them up to Maine and they're racing them down tracks, to learn some of those science lessons. Comparably, we have them build boats and get out on waters. We've got to get on the water to learn some of their science lessons. We've got an amazing tradition at Belmont Hill where every graduate carves a wooden panel to graduate from our school. So baked into our DNA is a remarkable wood shop, furniture making kind of hands-on piece of what we do. I think that works incredibly well. Other things that we do here, we're Harkness based, discussion based with our humanities classes. But I also just think our teachers have such experience teaching boys. It's not uncommon for us to see a class of sort of squirrely seventh graders and a teacher to say, "Hey, go take a lap. You guys seem like you're not focused. Go take a sprint around the chapel and come back 5 minutes later, and then we'll try this again." And I'm not sure you would see that teaching strategy necessarily in a co-ed school, per se.
That takes me to another question. What do you look for in terms of your recruiting, whether it's administrative or faculty?
Yeah. I think the faculty, it's a great question. I think our school has a unique and strong culture, and it's really focused on this idea of character in boys. The other calling card phrase at Belmont Hill is working together. So this is a school that cares deeply about team, not just athletically, but the idea that people here are a part of something bigger than themselves. So these are sort of key core values, I would say. I often say, again, when I'm talking to prospective parents, we have a lot of really smart teachers at Belmont Hill who have a great depth of knowledge in their content area. But when I'm hiring, I'm way more interested to hear how they talk about character, because everything we do ultimately comes back to this idea of a dialogue about what it means to be a good man, what it means to be a good person. And so they have to kind of care more about that. And they have to love boys. Like, they have to be able to articulate what they love about working with boys. If there's one thing that the research from IBSC has shown us, is that
And
boys
that's
are,
the International Boys School
it
Coalition.
is, yes, the International Boys School Coalition. Boys are unbelievably relational learners. I think they're a little less focused on what the content is and a little more focused on, does this person at the front of the room know me, see me, kind of have my back? And it's remarkable what boys will do when that relational connection has been made. And so that's one of the things I'm always looking for when I'm hiring people is, can I see this person, making deep connections with boys? Some of that is about humor. Some of that, is about clear expectations. Some of it is about structure. I think Belmont Hill is a place that believes routine and structure is really important for boys. Another thing I would say that's really interesting is kind of our approach around mental health has been, I think, pretty successful. And I say that through the experience of COVID. And I'm always amazed about the kind of relative health of our boys, which isn't to say we don't have kids who are struggling. And I guess some examples of how that might be different at a boys' school would be, We often find we get more out of our boys in group settings, when it comes to mental health conversations than necessarily one-on-one all the time. So things like a group of boys talking about the emotional impact of having a really hard sports injury and doing that together, talking about challenging family dynamics, and realizing they're not alone with some of the stresses. I think another thing our counselors would say is boys often give you more when you walk shoulder to shoulder with them as opposed to look at them face to face. So it's not uncommon to see our counselor taking a boy with a dog for a walk around the track to have a conversation, as opposed to a sit down across the coffee table, tell me exactly what's going on, for you. I think often boys respond better when they're doing something else, while they're kind of having that conversation. So those are some things that I think are a little different, when you come to our school.
I love that image of walking around the track with a dog and somebody to talk to. I wonder, everything that you've learned in running a boys' school, what would you advise or like to share out to other kinds of schools, co-ed schools, but a range of different. I'm sure you picked some things up that are fresh and new that you may not have learned or not have learned how to manage if you had stayed at a co-ed school. And what would you take back?
It's interesting for me to answer that question. I'm often asking myself how much of what I love about this place is about being a boys' school and how much of it is just unique to Belmont Hill, and who we are. And the reality is it's probably a little bit of both. There could be opportunities for co-ed schools to be more intentional about how they group certain experiences. I mean, one example that I can give that was incredibly powerful, to me is going on a senior leadership trip at Belmont Hill, where we ask these boys to reflect upon what it's going to mean for them to leave their families, a pretty deep topic, when they head off to college. And I remember going on that first trip when I got here 8 years ago and seeing boys with their arms around each other, at times getting really emotional, crying, with each other, and this notion of sort of brotherhood and supporting one another, feeling fundamentally different than anything I had experienced in a co-ed environment. Like you just wouldn't replicate the same experience with a co-ed teenage group as we are able to in that moment. And I think there could be opportunities for pieces of that co-ed schools could potentially take advantage of. But honestly, when I think more broadly about Belmont Hill, it's funny, I've written about and thought about how much we as leaders shape institutions and how much they shape us. And this is a place that has an organic, living, breathing culture that's very special. The search committee told me that it was the school's greatest asset, that it wasn't about facilities, or anything else, but that this culture that's been handed down through overlapping generations of longstanding teachers is a special thing here. And as a leader, there's really nothing more important you do than support that. And I guess the words I'd use about our culture have to do with character, accountability, working together, personal best, standard of excellence, team. These are the things that I think are really valued. And I also would say our definition of character today has evolved, and it still means things like toughness and resilience, which we think are important. But now it very actively includes conversations around empathy, listening, vulnerability, belonging. Being a good person is also about understanding and working with and through difference, in really important ways.
Would you say that's an expanded definition of masculinity then?
I would. Yeah. I think those things are related, what it means to ultimately be a man of good character, which is the phrase that we use. Another thing I would say about our school that I've come to appreciate, and it challenges me at times, is that we have a really wide range of political viewpoints within our kids and also within our faculty. And so I really believe this is a place where different viewpoints are expressed and can be expressed. I will say, as a teacher, I teach ethics. One thing I have loved about teaching in a single sex environment is that I see boys more willing to take intellectual risks and try on ideas. And sometimes they get it wrong. And sometimes we can name them as not, particularly well thought out, but they can bounce back and recover and really learn from making mistakes along the way in a slightly different way than I think you can in a co-ed context. And, again, there are also advantages that co-ed environments have that we don't have. That's also true. But I just think it's important that the boys' school option is out there because I think for certain families and for certain boys, it really works well.
Well, I'd like to kind of expand the conversation a little bit and get into something that everybody who runs a school faces, and that is governance. When you first take on a headship, you begin to work intensely with a board. As an experienced head of school at 2 independent schools, I wonder what wisdom you can share about the head board partnership. What kind of advice would you give to an incoming head of school?
Yeah, it's a great question. As everyone knows, and NAS says, there's no more important relationship to one's success than this, what we're talking about here. I've been blessed at both schools to have exceptional board chairs who have been deeply committed. I also know of other heads that have had to cycle through lots of board chairs along their careers, and I think that can be challenging. I think Belmont Hill is unusual in that I've had the same board chair for 8 years. He's been the board chair here for over a decade. I think it's common that heads face more turnover than I have. And because that relationship is strong, we feel like we're making a lot of good progress together. I can say one thing that's unique to Belmont Hill's governance, which we know does not necessarily fit into NAS best practice, but it works really well for us, is that we have 5-year terms for our trustees, but they are renewable. And so we have a board of just over 30, and there's probably 15 or 20 people in that room who have been trustees for well over 10 years, some over 30. Some people have been there a very long time. And as a day school, it's probably 2/3 alumni, which is unusual. And I think that has made for strong governance at this school. I think it's more typical to see day schools populated by higher percentage of current parents.
Is that intentional to have more alumni?
It is intentional, I think, for us. I think, though, we still think having current parents are critical, and we have them. And it's pretty common that a current parent trustee might serve 5 or 10 years on our board, but often alums might serve longer if they have that commitment and investment to the school. And I think the balance is really healthy. I think that it's important that trustees can position themselves to try to think 25, 50 years out and not necessarily about what's happening tomorrow. So I think those things have been critical. When I think about why my board chair relationships have been successful, I think there's a fundamental trust and honesty, and that happens over time. It's obviously different in year one than a relationship that, has some history. I'm at the point now where with my board chair, we've navigated, as you know, a pandemic, a racial reckoning, all kinds of world events and challenges, not to mention the sort of internal events unique to our school. And you do build up a lot of trust by going through those things. And I think he knows what I need to be successful. I think sometimes that's just reassurance. My board chair is also phenomenal in what I would call a crisis, the ability to kind of step back. And really around my boardroom, there's just a ton of wisdom and experience, and I can go to different people. I learn a ton from my trustees, and that has been great. But nurturing that is really important. Again, for this school, it has a unique culture, and I think part of it is there is trust that runs from the board through the leadership team right down to the faculty. A sense that the faculty feel our board is looking out for them.
That's interesting. That's terrific.
It's that sort of working together trust piece that runs through this institution. I credit my predecessor, Rick Melvoin, and others that came before me. That was here. And my job is to make sure to not mess that up because I appreciate that it's a really special dynamic that we have here.
How do you facilitate that?
I think one of the things our board does that's critical is they're constantly messaging, both in their actions and their words, how important the faculty is to the school, and the staff, whether that's through what we do around faculty chairs, how we think through compensation and benefits, public events, where speeches are made. And often these trustees, many of the teachers are still here, that they had, when they were at Belmont Hill. And, what I appreciate is I've got a lot of really smart people around this table who are frankly at the top of their industry, but they also know that when it comes to education and curriculum, you know, the leadership team is the expert, and just because these people went to school, for 20 years,
Doesn't mean they know how to teach.
yeah, they don't assume that they know the best way to navigate how we're handling graduation requirements or thinking about our athletic program. I think what our board does do, which is really helpful, is they're really challenging us about how the market is changing around us. And they're asking us to think deeply about value proposition and to be strategic about where are the areas where the school wants to remain kind of countercultural intentionally, and where are the areas that we just need to evolve, whether that's about AI and the future of education, whether that's about the landscape of athletics and how much that's changing around us. There are a lot of big questions that we're wrestling with.
I know the boards have to make a lot of tough decisions, so I want to circle back a little bit to something that you and I both experienced, and that is bringing on an outside group to the campus. I know that partnerships and bringing in other organizations is something that a board would discuss as an option for many different reasons, and that you brought in the International Boys School Coalition Conference. What was that experience like? How did you prepare for it? Why did you and the board and the team decide to go ahead with it? And lots of good reasons, but also I think as many school heads think about hosting something at their campus, there are reasons to really think about it carefully. So
Yeah. I appreciate you asking. I mean, again, credit to my predecessor, Rick, who, when I came to Belmont Hill, suggested to me that he thought IBSC would be a really meaningful connection. The International Boys School Coalition, which, started as a group of boys school heads in North America concerned about the future of boys schools because so many schools were going co-ed. And over time, it has become a group of 270 plus member schools around the world. I serve on that board as its treasurer at the moment. And we do host an annual conference every year. And there was a moment where someone said, we're thinking about coming to Boston. And when I brought it to my leadership team, the response was, well, if they want them to come to Boston, we want them to come to Belmont Hill, which was great to hear as the head. I think we did chalk it up at some point to seemed like a good idea at the time, because then it became reality. We had 750 people here from around the world. And as you know, possibly the hottest day in the history of June in Boston, which created its own challenge. But the only reason it really worked is that our trustees, our board saw the value both in the organization and the opportunity for Belmont Hill. And so it was really fun to partner with them to think about speakers we wanted to have, events we wanted to host. Our trustees are really committed not just to Belmont Hill, but to the city of Boston. And I think that they saw this as a chance to showcase their city to the world because they serve on a number of other nonprofits, cultural, medical across our city. So it was great to have those connections, but I think it was also great to have the opportunity. And then I think it also I think Belmont Hill really wants to be a leader in the conversation about educating boys worldwide. And this was an opportunity for us to step forward and try to present what we do that we think is unique, to try to be thought provoking about the future of education for boys. I think, as you know, some of the highlights for us is in terms of speakers was having one of our graduates, Mark Milley, who was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, speak. I mean, he's just a remarkable person to talk about the connections about character, Belmont Hill, and service. And in that way, I think inspiring. I'd say future forward thinking, like our parent Nubara Fayan, in terms of the work he's doing and, investing in new technologies. But another, for me, a real fun one that was challenging, but really I thought was eye-opening was the panel of university presidents. And, to have the presidents of Harvard, Williams, and Northeastern, three very different schools, talking about both the future of education and then, trying to get them to speak about the experience of boys specifically, which was, I know you probably reacted the same way. It was interesting to see how they reacted to that. It's a hard topic, I think, for everybody to address. I think for me, it was interesting to see, not surprisingly, the Northeastern president go right to the co-op program and the sort of hands-on experience and how boys respond to that in a particular way. And I think there's probably some truth to that. I think we think about that in the same way at Belmont Hill a little bit about the sort of real world hands-on kind of piece of learning. But as you know, it was a rich conversation in so many ways. I will say by the end of it, I think our community was just really proud, to have had that chance to showcase ourselves. We know every time we go to one of those conferences, we have a lot to learn. But maybe the last thing I'll say about that is it's amazing how sometimes we feel like we have more in common with that boys' school in, Sydney, Australia, in terms of their challenges and the conversations they're having than we might with, a co-ed school that's 3 miles away in Boston. And it's not to say there's no commonality there, but it's a different kind of kinship and conversation about the specific nature of boys learning, that is, um, it's really wonderful to have an international perspective on that. I think as Americans, we can get trapped in our own paradigms. Like one of the biggest ones is college, like our obsession with how do we get kids into college? And like you talk to different countries and it's like, it's just not a thing in the same way that it is here. I think the diversity conversations are really different. We have our own paradigm in the US about how we're thinking about that. Well, New Zealand and Australia have really interesting paradigms they're dealing with, when it comes to diversity. And I think that we have something to learn from them and vice versa. So I feel lucky to be a part of that group.
I can't help but ask you this. So, as you mentioned during the IBSC conference, Boston had record heat, and you all had a lacrosse game scheduled midday as part of the conference, as for all of us, for all the attendees of the conference, and you had to cancel it because it was so hot. And can you tell our listeners what you decided to do instead?
I think I know what you're referencing. Yeah, the idea for the lacrosse game, I went to a conference in New Zealand and there happened to be a rugby game that was happening there. And it was just it was fabulous to be having your lunch and just watching these kids compete in a sport that's not as prevalent, in our country. And so originally we thought, well, what's one that's sort of like that for us? And lacrosse came to mind because it's not necessarily international, in nature. But you're right. As the index went up on the turf fields, it was pretty clear that was not going to be a good idea for a whole bunch of reasons. But the thing that we did do, and I got talked into this when I first heard it, I was like, are we really going to do this? But we happened to have two people working at Belmont Hill who are professional skydivers. They talked me into jumping out of a plane in their coat and tie and coming down into the middle of the conference, which at the time, I was like, "This is either gonna be the best idea I've ever had, or I'm gonna be looking for a new job." And one of the 2. But as you know, they did make it down, to the field unscathed. Interestingly, I guess this is being recorded, but that is I should send you a copy of our recent bulletin because that is now the cover picture.
Oh, how wonderful.
Our school
How
counselor.
wonderful is that? Oh my goodness. That's terrific. No, it was I mean, talk about a pivot. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it. It was terrific. It was terrific. So we're winding down here a little bit. I wanna get to some questions about reflection, inspiration, and let's start with the hard one, the hard question. What keeps you up at night?
Sure, that is the $1,000,000 head of school question. And I think all I can say is depending on what school you're at, I think you have different answers, and I've been at two different schools and I've loved them both, for different reasons. I would say at this school, at this moment in time, and when I think about our industry, I really do worry about where the next generation of great teachers coming from, and I think this is it's an issue for all independent schools. It's an issue for boys schools. And we're talking about how we're going to rethink marketing the profession to the next great group of people. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, obviously, COVID was a massive challenge to teachers and led to plenty of people going in different directions. I also think the rise of remote work in our society is a new challenge for us. In many ways, I think teaching was viewed as a kind of quality of life profession in some ways, in terms of raising family and summers and, what have you. And now we're up against making more money and potentially being at home 3 out of the 5 days. And we're going to ask you not to be here 5 days, but 6 days a week to be a part of a community and, dive in. And those of us who do it all know why you'd want to do that. But I just think we can't assume that the next generation is going to think that that's an obvious choice, and we're going to have to. I think NAIS can help with this. I think IBSC can help with this, but we're going to have to really thoughtfully market, the profession as a choice, because we all know the financial models aren't drastically changing, and nobody's going into this profession, to make it big financially. And so I think we're going to have to be really, really good about articulating the rewards, associated with doing that work. And it's something I'm passionate about and want to do more work. I think the second one I'd just say unique to our area, which is probably not unique. It's unique to all kind of landscapes like ours, is what's gone on in the housing market, has just been so difficult, I think, for schools to keep up with. And as much as we may feel we compensate people well, I think our teachers are in a fundamental different place than they were 20 years ago, trying to have a family and make a life, whether that's Belmont Hill or pick any other school in a major urban city. And I don't think just continuing to raise salaries by 3 to 5% or whatever it is we're doing is going to be enough. Ultimately, there's going to be a breaking point, particularly at a school like ours, which is so deeply committed to this idea of the teacher coach model. And our folks are just getting pushed further and further and further away from the school. And, that is a real challenge for us that we're thinking about. So that keeps me up at night. I think the last one I already referenced, but I'll just bring it back to you again, which is this idea of market shifting around us. Certainly the arrival of AI, I think, is challenging us to ask what really matters in education. And I think we will figure that out, but it is hard. I think, we're a school that has a long tradition of kind of scholar athletes, and the athletic landscape and sort of what's gone on with both at the college level and things that are trickling down from the college level into our landscape are challenging, whether that's NIL or league reorganization or, a million things you could talk about. But then I also look at, private equity buying up youth sports around us and the unbelievable machine that parents are feeling. And by the way, I have kids. I'm a part of this machine as a consumer. And, what it's doing to kids, I think, is really concerning. I think it's also calling into question, where does the school fit into this equation now, of what the athletic landscape looks around. I think it's changing ultimately.
It's been accelerating for some time.
So I think that the market shifts are coming fast. And, another thing we talk about sort of in our boardroom is we all know this issue that higher ed has struggled with, of kind of losing the public trust in some way or another, however you want to define that. And I think we're really committed to making sure we learn from that. And when we think about our value proposition, we're making decisions that retain the trust that we have with our families. I mean, right now it feels like it's in a good place, but making sure that the education stays relevant, what we offer is relevant. I think that's going to be important for us, in the next couple of decades.
What do you do for inspiration? Do you have any particular books you read or something you listen to or watch or?
Yeah, I'm definitely a reader, and I go in and out of education books. I got to be honest, left to my own devices, I'm a fiction reader. I was a creative writer in college, and sort of I love the escape and experience of getting into other human experiences. I'm a jazz musician, so that's a place where I find both refuge and, inspiration in a whole bunch of ways. I've got other things that keep me balanced and sane, like exercise and golf, and what have you. So those are some things. But if you asked me what actually inspires me, to like keep doing the work, I mean, I'm just amazed by these boys. And I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast has a version of this of their own students, right? That they're working on. But I'll just give you one example that happened in the last week. We have these remarkable affinity dinners at Belmont Hill. Last night it was a Lunar New Year dinner with kind of our Asian community. We have a Shabbat dinner with our Jewish community, and a new one this year as was this remarkable, Muslim community dinner, so kind of educating and celebrating food associated with Ramadan. And that's a group that's grown at our school. But I just had this experience of a senior student leader who sort of organized this whole thing, educating all these families who were coming to learn more, about his culture. And what was amazing was to see some of our, Orthodox Jewish families come to this Muslim dinner, in a spirit of learning and sharing. And I talked to one of these mothers on the way out, and I just said, it's awesome that you came to this, and that you were a part of this. And she looked at me and she said, I mean, it's nothing that I came. What's amazing is that this young man who's running the event came up to me as I walked in, thanked me for being here, and told me how excited he was to go to the Shabbat dinner in a couple of weeks so that he could learn, more about her culture. And she just sort of looked at me and was like, "This is what the world needs." Like this is the kind of curiosity, bridge building, that I think when we look around us, we're just craving it. And, when you work with these kids, it makes you so hopeful, right? I mean, again, when we talk about marketing the profession, right? This is the opportunity, that we have, to inspire leaders, to kind of try to make the world a better place. And I think we'd all agree we need it now more than ever.
Of course we do. And well, that's a wonderful model and a great example. So kudos to you and Belmont Hill, and especially the young man who's made it happen.
He's the one that deserves credit. And you go to these things where they're talking about their cultures, and you also just get a sense of how much they care about their families and how much they want to do the right thing. And I don't think that's always the stereotypical societal image of adolescent boys, and it's important that people know that that's who they are, ultimately.
Well, also they need a safe place to be that person.
I think that's true. And it is about belonging. It is about community. It is about safety, but it's also a place where you can take some risks. And it's about curiosity. I mean, I'm such a believer too that these schools are great at producing people who can, you know, make a point, prove a point, win an argument, win, win, win. I'm always emphasizing with these guys, there's nothing more important than being willing to have your opinion changed, and being fundamentally open that by experiencing and listening, you might have something wrong, because as long as we all think we have it right, we're in trouble, and I think it probably was somebody like John Meacham who said this, that, you know, if we lose that fundamental ability to think that our opinion could be shifted by an experience, we're in trouble. And so that's one of the things I really try to emphasize with the boys, particularly as they head off to college, and they have what I just described in this environment, but then what will it mean for them to be the leaders who can bring that, to their next community? That's really important to me.
Well, and the ability to, even if you're not going to have your opinion changed, to sit side by side with somebody of a different opinion is very significant.
And, again, we're lucky. I don't think it's true at every school. This is a place that has a pretty broad spectrum of political opinions, both on the teachers and on the faculty. And I'll be honest, there are times when that really challenges me as the leader, but I am convinced it makes the learning better. I think I appreciate it because I see it here in a different way than I did in my environments before I got here. I think it makes for better learning, and what what you see is because there's this underlying brotherhood, there's this underlying emphasis on we're one school with many voices. We're all playing for the same team. We all wear the Belmont Hill jersey. I think there's a different kind of ability to disagree and notice difference and work through that because there's a sense here of this shared experience. Like we're all Belmont Hill boys. Nobody's a guest. There's nobody's a guest here. We're all full community members. And by the time they graduate, I think there's this appreciation for the mosaic of the class and what they all add, to every unique class that we have at this school.
And it's wonderful that they get comfortable with that and learn to expect it.
I think they do. And I think when they leave, part of the reason that we're lucky to have the alumni involvement that we have here, I joke, sometimes I feel like I'm running a cult, not a school, but I think people leave this place and they do appreciate how special it is, to have that culture that I described earlier in the podcast.
I have one final question. What makes you most proud of in your career, in your long journey?
What makes me most proud of my career, I think probably connects to what I said earlier about waking up every day and knowing you have this opportunity to give back. I think about the role models and the mentors I had that shaped me. I feel really honored to have a chance to do that with these kids. I'm unbelievably proud of the teachers here. I just think what the dedication I see, like I feel like I've got some skills and it's great that I can lead a school. I am not the best teacher here. I'm not the best coach here. Like I look at what some of these people can do with a group of boys and where they can take them. And I'm just blown away, by that. And so I feel like it's my job to assemble that group of people to try to create the conditions where they can just do their thing, and feel supported and that they can grow. So I'm proud of that. I mean, when I think about Belmont Hill specifically, I've used this story a lot in the Belmont Hill context, but I have one relatively younger trustee. When you come in, you talk to all the trustees and you say, what advice do you have? And, he paused and he looked at me and he's just like, look, Belmont Hill has always been a place that's been willing to do the right thing. And if you can do that, the rest is going to take care of itself. And so I feel proud to work in a place. I feel proud to work at a place that I think really believes in that, really believes in, and that doesn't mean we always get it right, but we're really committed to trying to do the right thing specifically for these boys. And, as a leader, if there's any mantra that I live by, it's like, we exist for the boys. That's why we're here. I got lots of constituencies that I'm trying to keep happy and they don't always agree. But when you're the head and you have to make a hard decision, if people around you can see that you're trying to make decisions that are in the best interest of the students, in our case, the boys, then I can sleep well, at night. And so I try to keep that as my sort of leadership North Star.
Sounds like a good one. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks for listening to NAIS Member Voices. You can find some related NAIS resources from this episode by visiting nais.org/member voices. You can also keep an eye on that page for information about past and upcoming episodes. Please be sure to subscribe to Member Voices wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And go back and listen to previous episodes you might have missed. If you have feedback for us, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know how we're doing. You can also send us your thoughts and suggestions on what you'd like to hear on a future podcast by emailing membership@nais.org.